to the next part. I think it's part 7, I think, are we on? Can't remember, I'm losing touch. Anyway, I think it's part 7 of Empire of Normality. So, so I was discussing eugenics. So, following an Allied victory in the war, many eugenics professors, Chapman says, switched roles. Eugenics became genetics. It was still focused on eliminating abnormalities, even if this was framed as an individual medical problem more than issues around race. Again, Chapman talks about the anti-psychiatrists. So the anti-psychiatrists were a group of psychiatrists who challenged psychiatric pathologization in the 1960s and 70s, most notably Ronald Lang, who said that schizophrenia was a reasonable reaction to distressing family dynamics. And Irving Goffman saw diagnosis as labels, and another notable anti-psychiatrist was Foucault. Anti-psychiatry was cross-political, so again, people on the left and the right could be anti-psychiatrists, or go for different reasons. Chapman then says that many American psychoanalytic psychiatrists overtook the running of asylums without reforming them, and many barbaric practices continued much as before. Patriarchal, racialised and heteronormative power relations manifested in who was deemed mentally ill and how the problems were interpreted. For example, women were pathologised as hysterical for challenging patriarchy, etc. Now, anti-psychiatry Anti-psychiatry critiqued the very concept of mental illness upon which they took psychiatry's power to be founded. This was very much in the 1960s, anti-psychiatry arose. So again, he talks about Satz. Now, Satz was skeptical. Satz was sceptical that psychiatry was a genuine branch of medicine, and he was against involuntary confinement, and he saw psychiatry as social control. His historical claim was that mental illness was a metaphor proposed in the 1800s, and that over time, psychiatry had come to forget it was a metaphor. Given this error, Satz argued, psychiatry came to respond to mental illness as if it was a genuine medical issue. They tried to locate and treat it in the brain, though there is no evidence, according to Satz, that this was biologically grounded. Now, Satz, Chapman says, did not challenge the concept of neurological normality in his critique of mental illness, in contrast to the neurodiversity proponents. Satz's assumption was that the concept of biological normality Satz's assumption was that the concept of biological normality was scientific, and that underpinned his critique. So if there was no known neurological abnormality underpinning mental problems, then the problem was not a medical problem, only a problem in living, according to Satz. Objective bodily medicine was seen as superior to the value-laden psychiatry. Satz said that whether the psychiatrist thought someone was mad was a subjective judgment, not an objective fact. Now, the key reason the Satzian vision was able to become so influential was that most of the problems he identified regarding the treatment of patients were all too real. For example, abuse in institutions, or women labelled as hysterical, and black civil rights protesters were labelled as psychotic. and gay people were labelled as ill, etc. All manifestations of mental illness for SATs were recast as non-medical problems in living. He saw the social control of patients. He saw the social control of patients as not as stemming from capital and estate, but from the very idea of mental illness itself. So, by the way, Chapman sees psychiatry as a form of social control. That runs throughout his book, his idea that psychiatry is a form of social control. But Chapman does not see psychiatry in and of itself as bad. He's not an anti-psychiatrist, but he sees this social control as stemming from capital and estate. So the idea that if you could, move beyond capitalism to a sort of socialist society, that then you wouldn't have this problem of social control. So that's the kind of theme running throughout his book. Now, Chapman also makes it clear that support for anti-psychiatry turned out to be useful for many states that wanted to save money. So it allied itself very nicely with right-wing agendas. It was useful for the ruling class rather than helping to resist the dominant system. I'd argue neurodiversity is also useful for the ruling class. The neurodiversity paradigm itself, I'd argue, is useful for the ruling class. I mean, Chapman does make that point earlier on, about the fact that the neurodiversity paradigm has been corrupted, and he would say that the neurodiversity that's been corrupted by the ruling class is not the neurodiversity that he himself would endorse. Just the wrong version of the paradigm, if you like. But but if you look at anti-psychiatry, many left-wing people of the time supported anti-psychiatry. They saw it as liberating, and yet it was taken up by the ruling class as a way to make cuts. And I'd argue that actually the neurodiversity paradigm has been, regardless of some of the left-wing progressive intentions of some of it, or some of those who endorse it, has actually, all in all, been very been used by it's acted almost like cinder for the ruling class to make cuts, and I feel that even those who have progressive intent and will say, no, that's not the version that we mean, but that'd be a bit like the anti-psychiatrists, the progressive anti-psychiatrists, the ones on the left at the time, would be like, no, that's not the form of anti-psychiatry we mean. But it seems to be very naive and myopic to kind of ignore what is happening, and I feel that's why the neurodiversity paradigm is actually becoming very dangerous, I would say, for people relying on state support, because of this very strong current within it opposing medicine. Okay. So Chapman then talks about how, in significant part, asylums were shut down. Asylums were shut down alongside rhetoric about returning patients to community to cut costs. So it was cutting costs that drove the shutting down of the asylums more than any ideas around liberation. There was very much a kind of a practical economic reason for shutting them down. And Satsian skepticism regarding the reality of mental illness was useful for justifying this. So Chapman argues that Sats was misguided, his politics failed to liberate. Again, he talks about the Marxist psychologist Peter Sedgwick, who was anti-psychiatry's most insightful critic at the time, who argued that Satz's arguments were driven by hard-right libertarian politics, hyper-individualism. Every individual having complete responsibility and freedom. So this underpins Satz's belief that people self-identified as mentally ill to take on a sick role that allowed them to avoid taking personal responsibility for dealing with their problems in living. Pretending to be ill to avoid responsibility, he saw them as morally weak liars pretending to be ill. Does that sound familiar? It's what many Tories still argue today. Satz said that the myth of mental illness was a myth made and sustained by patients and psychiatrists. He wanted state support to be abolished. He wanted to go back to a pre-medical conservative worldview, where what we now call mental illness was understood in moral rather than medical sphere. Yes, so that's where I'm going to leave you for now. I will come back to this next time. So still quite a lot to get through. So I've just got up to that bit. Next time I'll mention Hayek. I'm going to talk a little bit about Hayek and how that links in with Satz. Okay, so thank you for watching.